Jacob Hubbard. That sounds like Jacob Hutter, which was a 16th century leader of the Hutterites, Jacob Hutter. But you're Jacob Hubbard, so you're the leader of the Hubbardites. But 1,000 Pine Points to you. Hey, Camille, stick around. I might need you. The reason why I titled this "A Christian Doctor Thoroughly Debunks the Resurrection" is just for fun. Because this is the way Cameron Bertuzzi labeled or titled his video, "A Medical Doctor Thoroughly Debunks." I think Cameron knows that this is just a game as far as making titles. I think he realizes that. What's interesting to me is that within this video, and this is why I kind of still like my title, within this video, this Christian medical doctor kind of debunks the resurrection hypothesis. He gives a more likely explanation. And so I thought that was interesting. Before we go on, by the way, have you guys been having troubles receiving notifications from me or any YouTube channel? Because I've noticed things have been weird on YouTube lately. So let me know if you are having problems seeing me go live. You know what the cool kids say. They say you're supposed to hit the bell thing, the notification bell, and the cool kids say you're supposed to subscribe for sure, and the cool kids say you're supposed to follow me on Twitter at PineCreek, except it's a 1 instead of an I. And the cool kids also have Facebook groups and so forth, which I have one called PineCreek Doug. What else do the cool kids do? Oh, they have Discord channels and Reddit links and all that sort of thing, but I don't do that. Nope, I've been getting them regularly. It's interesting because Camille was saying that something wasn't going through his feed, and I had another subscriber say that yesterday's live stream I didn't go through. So I'm not sure what the problem is. Maybe it's because ad revenue is going down because of the coronavirus that is causing less. I don't know what's going on. It's a problem with YouTube. They're aware of the issue. Oh, it's okay. It isn't a problem with YouTube. See, for example, most live streams I do, within the first 15, 20 minutes, I think I'm up to 150 viewers. And watch, this won't get over 80. There won't be more than 80 to 90 viewers here. I could be wrong. Maybe it's because of the time of the day I've been streaming. But ever since the coronavirus or the last couple weeks, something weird's been going on. Okay, I'm going to skip around here. I'm going to go to the part where he actually debunks the resurrection and gives a more naturalistic explanation. And for the Christians watching, I'm going to actually steel man him as much as I can. I think you'd appreciate that, right? But I'm also going to be honest with you, and if I think this man has poor critical reasoning skills, I'll say so. I'll say it right now. I think he has poor critical reasoning skills when it comes to his beloved, deeply held belief, Christianity. And that's common. It's actually very common. Okay, so, and kudos to Cameron. He asked about the bereavement hypothesis, which I've actually talked about on my channel a bit.
And the link is in the description of the video as well. I should mention that again. So if you guys want to read it, it's free. You can check it out there. But before we get on to Q&A with the audience, I did want to see if we could cover quickly the bereavement hypothesis.
Oh, yes. And that's important because bereavement, when my grandfather died, my grandmother told me that she had several experiences where she heard him calling her name.
Yes, personal anecdotal story. He says his grandfather died. His grandmother heard just one sensory input, heard his grandfather. Now, I have a paper on my hard drive, but the stats on this is actually pretty amazing. That when a spouse dies, don't quote me on this, but I think it's something like 15% of spouses will either see, hear, or even feel their spouse, their dead spouse. They have an experience of their spouse. One could also say they have an appearance of their spouse. And I think it also applies to loved ones. So if you have a loved one who died, you will have this experience. Hey, Muscle Philosopher, Doug, I love your channel. If able, please put this towards caring for your sister. Interesting. I don't know if that's possible. But my sister is, the reason why it's not that easy is because my sister is 2,000 miles away up in Canada. And of course, as you know, the borders are closed. And I don't even know if, it's not worth a wire transfer. But anyhow, I appreciate the donation. And by the way, my sister, some people have been asking about that. My sister is worse as far as she wants to die now. So, but she's hanging on for dear life. And but the thing is, if she was to die in the next month or so, I couldn't even go to my own sister's funeral because of the state of affairs in the world right now. But anyhow, the bereavement hypothesis, I think, is a great naturalistic explanation for Christianity instead of the resurrection. And he talks about it here. He's admitting that when a loved one dies, you can have even an appearance of your loved one to you, which is not real.
And those things very often occur at the interface between wakefulness and sleep. When people are about to fall asleep, there's some sort of what's called a hypnagogic experience where they're changing into a sleep mode. So those things are common, and they're not considered pathological. That's a normal.
That's an important point. He's saying people who go through this bereavement type hallucination, they're not crazy. They're not nuts. They're not mentally ill. And he said this is quite common. I'm steel manning him here, okay? They're not crazy. They're not nuts. They just deeply love someone who's now passed away, someone who they've spent a significant amount of their life with, and now they're gone, and they still experience this person.
Part of grieving. Visionary experiences within bereavement are not very common, maybe about 4%.
4% of people who've lost a loved one will actually see them after they're dead. 4%. So let's say Jesus had 1,000 followers or 100 followers. Let's make it simple. 100 followers. It says in 1 Corinthians that there's at least 500 followers. But anyhow, that's 4 people. Their names could even been Peter, John, James. Like, he's coming up with a great naturalistic explanation for Christianity and how it spread and so forth, how it got off the ground.
In complicated grief where people are having, it's more severe and extended grief, it may be as much as 10% that they could have an experience like that.
10%.
But they are generally transient. When people try to interact with a visionary experience, it dissipates. And they can last for years. So you can experience your loved one who's passed away for years, and maybe even for 40 days. See what I did there? Book of Acts. Generally, I think I cite in the paper that for people that experience those things, it can be persistent for maybe 10 years and then kind of start to taper off. Now, that's very different from the disciples who saw Jesus for, 30 days and then he's gone.
Yeah, he said 30 days. I thought it was 40 days. This is where there's a fundamental difference between guys like him and guys like me, is basically the reliability of the New Testament. So he's saying what I just described, okay, I'm steel manning him here. By the way, what is his name? His name is Joseph Bergeron. I'm trying to steel man him here. He's saying, look, there is this thing called bereavement hallucinations experiences. They can last a long time, but they're transitory. They don't last, like they come and they go. This cannot be the case for the disciples or the followers of Jesus in the first century, because they walked and talked with him for 40 days after he rose from the dead. He appeared to several people at one time. So this cannot be an explanation for what happened, because the text says that it wasn't transitory and all these things. And this is the fundamental difference between Christians and non-Christians who have investigated it and rejected it. This is the main difference. They don't buy the story. They don't buy the text, what the text is saying. Now, if you are a person who believes everything in the New Testament, because let's say you were taught and raised to believe that this is the Word of God and it's basically perfect or inerrant or pretty close to perfect or pretty close to inerrant, then of course you're going to say, well, yeah, we can trust this. This is a reliable thing. It's you can even say it's all the attestations and eyewitness testimony and the martyrdom. And I bet you anything this guy believes all that stuff I just said. I'm willing to wager 10,000 points this guy would say those exact things. There was so many reasons to believe in the reliability. But here's the problem. The problem is I could ask a question to this Bergeron guy and say, is there anything that claims to be historical in the New Testament that you think probably didn't happen in the past? If I was to give you 5 claims in the New Testament, could you order them from most reliable to least reliable? Now, this is what I'm not so sure about, but my guess is he couldn't do that. He couldn't take 5 claims of the New Testament and rank them in order of reliability. He would, I think, this is my guess, I think he would say, no, it's all reliable. This is a reliable historical record. By the way, he wrote a book with Gary Habermas on this topic. But here's the problem if you just say that it's all reliable. Oh, by the way, Bob Skane, thank you so much for the donation. Satan told me he is really happy with all the new recruits you're sending him. Keep up the good work. Yeah, well, thank you. I have a personal relationship with Satan. Sorry. I didn't mean to scare people away. What was I going to say? Yeah, if you're going to believe that the New Testament or the Bible in general is a reliable document of a historical record, then I don't understand why there's even apologists, or why apologists even try to build the confidence in their own flock, in the believers, because all they have to say is, well, just read it. It says Jesus appeared to 500 and the disciples and to the women, and that he was in the tomb and then he was out of the tomb. Just read it. It's there. And then you're done, right? If you think it's a reliable source of history, just read the text. It says Jesus rose from the dead in bodily form. So that must mean he did. And this is the fundamental problem between guys like him, or Christians and non-Christians.
When people have these kind of bereavement experiences, they don't tell people about them. They consider them private. The studies that
Well, how did you know about your grandma and grandpa if they don't tell people? I think some people might say, "Oh, I'm going to keep this to myself, that I experienced my dead loved one coming back and talking to me, because people are going to think I'm crazy." But as he said, this is a natural phenomenon. Happens. What did he say? 4 to 10% of the time. He said 4% of the time was even visual.
I cite in the paper, that was the first time that they really, described those experiences to anyone, in a public way. Those types of experiences, again, are singular. It's usually the spouse.
Yeah, usually the spouse. I've seen the same data. I think he's talking about same research. I think Jesus, if he was a charismatic character in the first century with a following, he was viewed as a spouse to the disciples. He was viewed as a figure who was so engaging, gave so much hope to people who are suffering, that they deeply loved him. So they viewed him almost like a spouse.
The most common one is a sense of presence, feeling a sense of the presence of a person, where the visual appearances are much more rare. Again, they're private, so groups of people don't experience the same bereavement, and usually it's only the spouse. But it could be, friends or relatives, but it's usually the spouse.
He's giving reasons. I can tell that he's trying to massage this to say, well, what I'm saying now, yes, we have data to back this up, but this doesn't apply to the case of Jesus, because Jesus wasn't a spouse. He wasn't married to the disciples. I dare to say that some followers of Jesus love Jesus more than their own wife or husband. That's if, according to the story, if Jesus was as charismatic and did all these great things, that they would have loved him deeply like a spouse.
Are there any well-known skeptics that are proposing this bereavement hypothesis as an explanation?
Yeah, PineCreek. I just did.
Well, the person I cite in the paper is Dewey Rees, who was a Welsh physician, and he identified himself as a Christian. His parents were influenced by the Welsh revival. He wrote a very important article in 1971, I think it was called Hallucinations of Widowhood. It was the first time that anyone looked at this and documented and studied it. So it was a very important article in that way. And, clued us medical people into, these are normal experiences. They're not pathological. And
They're not pathological. They're normal.
A part of grieving. He later wrote a book called Pointers.
I'm playing this first because I'm going to go back to the beginning later and play about 20 minutes or so, and you'll see a complete opposite picture of what's going on here.
To Eternity, where I think he overreached and said, well, this is kind of empiric evidence of eternity and spiritual experiences, and maybe it's similar to what the disciples experienced. But even he said, it really doesn't explain the group experiences. And it's noteworthy. It should be noted that.
Yeah, and this is the thing that I think a lot of Christians will fall back on. It doesn't explain the group experiences. But again, this goes to the reliability of the text. What if there were no group experiences or appearances? And in fact, I'm going to go to that now, because someone in the Q&A asked a great question. Probably was like an evil follower of Satan. Let's see if I can find it.
Again, they're symptoms of an underlying problem that is severe.
Gotcha. All right, here's a question from Retro Man. He says, can you confirm that the word used for appear in 1 Corinthians 15 can be used for both physical and spiritual visions?
Excellent question, because he's talking about group hallucinations. They don't happen, according to him. And so therefore, this whole bereavement thing doesn't really work, because the text says Jesus appeared to 500 and to all the disciples.
We talk about that in the paper, and that part of the paper was a contribution from Dr. Habermas primarily. But the word used there can be used for, oh, I see, like I understand, but...
Oh, I see, I understand, but I wonder if that form of the word appear would apply to Pentecostals in churches at 11:18 a.m. on a Sunday morning, that Jesus appeared to the congregation at a certain Pentecostal church, that they all said, oh, I get it, I understand. When they're in worship, 500 people, 500 Pentecostals worshiping Jesus, and they feel the Holy Spirit on them, and they say, Jesus appeared to me, I got it, I feel it, I understand it, a moment of clarity, I see him.
It is most commonly used for a physiologic sight, and it is considered, or a consensus of scholars to my understanding, and again, I would refer you to look at the paper because it is discussed there, would say that it is actually referring to physiologic sight.
Yeah. So here's, I guess, the question for guys like Dr. Bergeron is, well, I know Christians don't like the two words what if, but what if that word appear does mean like an aha moment, or I understand, or I sense the presence of? What if that word appear does mean that? And then combine that with the bereavement hypothesis of a small group of people who deeply, deeply love this charismatic figure, and Jesus appeared to them in the way we're describing, like a Pentecostal Sunday morning church service. That seems very reasonable, right? But again, if you are open to that hypothesis, then you might lose your hope, meaning, and purpose, and your basis for morality, and blah, blah, and you might get divorced from your spouse, and all the chain reaction occurs. So there's so much at stake and so much investment that to view that as a reasonable hypothesis, which has nothing to do with the swoon theory or the twin theory, all that silly stuff. It's just a very common thing that you admitted happens to, 5 to 10 to 15% of the general population who's lost a loved one. What if that's what happened? And a movement was started because of it. But that doesn't explain the book of Acts and Jesus eating fish with people and Thomas touching the side of... Well, you're assuming that the text is reliable at that point, right? And this is the difference between Christians and non-Christians. The Christians will just view this as a reliable text. The non-Christians, not so much. Okay, do I go back to the beginning now? Oh, no, I want to do one more Q&A thing here. To me, this shows that the reasoning skills of Dr. Bergeron is not up to par on this topic. Hey, thank you, Bob. I love that Canadian cash. Devs via qubits prove Jesus was crucified. Oh, yeah, you're talking about that. Are you talking about that TV show that I did a short little video on? Let's see if I can find it. Someone asked the question about what would be a good opposing view. Here we go.
From Nick M. He says, Doctor, I am an attorney in New York State, I think. I like to consider my opposing counsel's best arguments as such. What's the best argument against your theory, and why is it wrong?
So remember, his theory is, Dr. Bergeron's theory is that the hallucination hypothesis doesn't work. And here's an attorney from New York City asking, well, okay, let's steel man the other side for a second. What's the best argument against your theory? Spoiler alert, he already said it earlier when he's talked about the bereavement. He could have just said that, but what did he actually say? I actually forget what he said. Look up. This is a spider moment.
The best argument against...
Yeah, we haven't put forward a sort of theory. What we're doing is we're sort of arguing against the hallucination hypothesis as such. So it's not...
Yeah, Cameron makes a good point. It's like there's this hallucination theory, and Dr. Bergeron is arguing against it, why it's not possible. But the question that this guy was asking was, give the opposing view why it still is possible, why maybe the hallucination theory still could work. And like I said, I think he already answered that when he talked about the bereavement.
I think what I would, and I'm not sure if I'm answering you accurately, but when I started writing the paper, basically what I did was to take the explanations and deconstruct the logic of them from a medical perspective. And then I had Gary Habermas help me kind of interact with theological literature.
Theological literature. Theological or historical? Yeah, to me this is the best moment here.
Forward a sort of theory. What we're doing is we're sort of arguing against best argument in New York State, I think. I like to consider my opposing counsel's best arguments as such. What's the best argument against your...
Watch how the gears are grinding in his head right now. This is basically, even if you're a Christian, this is what you want to get out of an atheist. You just don't want the atheist to give you, the one-liners that you've heard 1,000 times before. Come up with questions that make them really stop and ponder and think.
Theory, and why is it wrong?
The best argument against...
Yeah, we haven't put...
Yeah, the other day on my Facebook page, it was the one on which Jew should I listen to, Michael Brown or Tovia Singer, and some Christian posted something like, Michael Brown just demolished Tovia Singer in this debate, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, if I paid you as an actor to pretend to say that Tovia Singer demolished your guy, Michael Brown, what's some bullet points you would make on why someone might view it the opposite way? And it's like, nope, not going there, not doing that. It's like, if you value this thing called truth, you should be able to, I think, give your opponent's view as well as they can. Well, maybe that's taking it too far, but at least you should be able to summarize it and understand the basics of where they're coming from. And look at this guy's face. He's like, why could the hallucination theory still work? I mean, and the thing is, he already kind of answered that earlier. Okay, let's start at the beginning now. Now with these things in your head here. I think we started at 445. Link in the description.
Yeah, so if you guys want to go check that out. And that's the topic of today that we're discussing is the hallucination hypothesis. So let's get clear on that. Like, what is the hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis?
Well, a hallucination is an experience in the conscious mind through the five senses, one or more of the five senses, without external stimulus, but it's real to the conscious mind of the individual. That's what a hallucination is. And so
I was going to say that I learned recently that there are, like you mentioned, it's to the five senses, so it doesn't just have to be to sight. I know someone who has tactile
Correct.
hallucinations, so it feels like they have spiders crawling over their arms.
Yes, that's a salient point. Most hallucinations are really unpleasant. They're not warm, fuzzy talks with your savior. They're someone in delirium.
Did he say most hallucinations were unpleasant? And remember, I just played a clip where he's talking about bereavement and having hallucinations of loved ones, spouses who have passed away. You would think that those would be very comforting.
Tremens or the DTs with alcohol withdrawal, they might see snakes crawling in the bed or elephants walking in the room, or the classic descriptions. Those are unpleasant and scary. Patients that I've seen that suffered from hallucinations, the hallucinations, again, were bad. They were telling the individual to jump out of the window and try to kill themselves or light themselves on fire or various things like that. People that suffer from hallucinations are sick.
See, remember what I just played? People who suffer from hallucinations are sick, he said. They have a mental illness. And I played just earlier, he's talking about when we're talking about the bereavement type hallucinations of hearing your loved ones. He said this is completely normal. It happens between 4% or 10% of the general population who've lost loved ones. Now he's saying hallucinations are sick. Now, I'm being maybe a little nitpicky here, but yeah, keep that in mind. It's like not all hallucinations are scary. Not some people can have hallucinations who are not mentally ill, according to him.
And that is missed by the proponents of the hallucination hypothesis, if you want to call it that. The first historical reference to anyone suggesting that the disciples were hallucinating was in Origin, was the debate with Celsus and Origen. Celsus was a 2nd century
Camille, if you're still here, you can fact check him on this.
Philosopher. And that's the first time we find this kind of idea entering into written historical texts. But the idea has traveled through time and has been embraced by certain individuals. In more recent times, I think one of the major proponents was the German scholar Gerd Ludemann, who's written several books.
Okay, yeah, I remember this. This is the part where I almost fell out of my chair laughing. No offense to Dr. Bergeron, but yeah, it's coming.
That propose this idea. The thing that is very telling about the hallucination hypothesis, or is very noteworthy, is that these things are proposed not by medical people, but by critical scholars of the New Testament, people without real medical background. They are not exposed to peer review within medical literature. They appear in books and debates and things by critical scholars, and they're not exposed to analysis by the more specialized readership within the medical community. And
before we went live, you even were saying that you personally have had experiences with people who have hallucinations, and it's they don't work with these people. And
Well, it's. I was reading one of Gerd Ludemann's books. I think, when I studied the crucifixion, I collected everything doctors had written, and then I wrote the medical journal article. When I decided to write about hallucinations, I collected everything I could possibly find, and so I read all of it, and all the people that propose this is basically the same thing. They say that, well, these people were hallucinating, or they had these experiences, and then they kind of just drop it there, and walk away, and there's your answer, folks.
Yeah, and this bothers Christians. I can tell that's really bothers. And the reason why a lot of people will just say, well, maybe a couple people hallucinated and that started the movement, sort of like Joseph Smith. The reason why they just drop it so fast is because Christianity is not relevant to them. They don't have a need for it. They don't care about Christianity. And I know that bothers Christians. And this is why Christians actually like things like the coronavirus, because it awakens a nation to the need for Jesus as their savior. So I can understand why guys like Dr. Bergeron feel this way. It's like they hallucinated or something, and they just walk away and they don't dive into it deeper. It's because they don't care about it. It's not relevant to their lives. The need is not there. They haven't been regenerated by the Holy Spirit.
Read it and believe it. And I was reading Gerd Ludemann's book, and I threw it on the ground, and I spoke to the book. And I said, "You believe that?" I was having my own delusion at the time. I don't know, I was talking to the book instead of Gerd. Maybe I should have called him on the phone or something. But, because he was proposing something that was so absurd to a medical mind.
This is where I almost fell off my chair laughing. Gerd Ludemann is proposing something so crazy that to the medical mind that people could have a hallucinating experience, a hallucination of a loved one. It just as in a group, like, this is preposterous to the medical mind. Keep in mind, he believes that a man rose from the dead, that a man walked on water. Why didn't you throw the Bible down when you read it and say this is preposterous to the medical mind? You see the irony here?
That it was laughable, buffoonery to me, balderdash.
Yeah, and this is exactly how most of the planet view the New Testament. Balderdash, lunacy. And I think the sooner Christians realize this, and maybe they already do, but they try to defend it like it's normal, like a man rise from the dead is like the default position, I think, would be that this is lunacy, and you need so much evidence to overcome that lunacy in order to believe it, which, in my opinion, is not even close to there.
If you want to say, because I have seen patients in delirium. It's not a pretty sight. I've seen people that have suffered from hallucinations. It's a very ugly thing to witness. As physicians, we see things.
Keep in mind the bereavement stuff that I played first, where he's saying that very normal people have hallucinations of loved ones. And he's painting this picture that no way, this is like a terrible thing, and they're sick. And so this is obviously not what happened with the disciples.
One physician told me, we were talking, and he said, we see things that people shouldn't have to see, and sometimes that's really true.
D.B. Sisko says, I propose that there were no hallucinations and that all the stories are fictional. Yes, that is another possibility that I think is on the table. I would say that some things could be historically true and some things historically false. That's such a reasonable position to take that I think it's very difficult for Christians to get around that one. That there are some things that are claimed in the New Testament as historical that are maybe not. And for the Christian, just that thought, I think for some Christians, that thought just terrifies them.
Things that are troubling. People that suffer from these kinds of illnesses, mental illness. I've seen some conversion disorder cases, and all the things that these folks want to propose. It was clear to me that they had no idea at all what they were talking about.
Oh, let's get back onto the hallucinations, what they are, what the hypothesis says. So in the paper, one of the things that you point out that I thought was really helpful was you point out that hallucination is the symptom. It's not a diagnosis. So why is that relevant to point that out?
Well, because that's where essentially everybody misses the point. You can't just say somebody's hallucinating and think that that's an answer. It's not the answer. You got to say why they're hallucinating.
Yeah, one reason why is because they lost a loved one that they deeply miss.
There is a reason, and the physician's job is to figure that out and to try to treat it. But hallucinations, we can group them into basically three types of etiology. Psychophysiological, if you will, which would be something like a malfunction of a structure in the brain. Certain types of strokes could be associated with hallucinations, or seizure activity.
Seizure activity, like maybe losing your eyesight for a little while. Who does that remind you of? A guy named Paul?
Illicit seizure hallucinations. What's called deafferentation. If the input to the occipital cortices of the brain is lost, that can sometimes, by a mechanism of a stroke, usually could cause hallucinations. But that's a structural issue in the brain that is malfunctioning. Another one would be a psychobiochemical, where there's something chemically occurring in the brain that causes hallucinations.
Yeah, maybe Paul had mushrooms.
An easy example is hallucinogenic drugs. As the name implies, they cause hallucinations. Or
what about something like OCD? Because a friend of mine has OCD, and he has tactile hallucinations. Would that fall in that category, like a biochemical?
No, it would not. It would be more of a psychological disturbance. And OCD, I don't know that it's associated with hallucinations per se. It's more of a compulsive disorder. So it may be more complex than what presents to your mind or explanation.
Gotcha.
So the biochemical one, like delirium tremens, like alcohol withdrawal I mentioned earlier.
Bub's gained 1,000 Pine Points for making me laugh on screen here. Satan just gave me an update. I'm only 2 souls away from a free toaster oven. Wow. Yeah, I got my quota. I met it last month, but this month I'm falling behind.
To see someone in a state of delirium is really, an unsettling thing to witness. And someone experience...
It's an unsettling thing. I know exactly what you mean, Dr. Bergeron. It is unsettling to witness.
But alcohol withdrawal, for example, is a dangerous thing. People need to be hospitalized for that, and they could have hallucinations like snakes crawling in the bed and those kinds of things. Very unpleasant. The third major type of etiology would be what's called psychodynamic, where the person is mentally ill, and then the psychosis intrudes into the conscious mind, and they would experience hallucinatory symptoms.
Yeah, and all of this excludes the bereavement hypothesis that people experience. They feel, they see, they hear a loved one who's died.
So where would you like to start in assessing this hypothesis? Because there's a couple things that I already have in mind, but I'm curious to see where you want to go first. What's the most important thing to keep in mind as we're starting to go along?
That people experiencing these things are sick, and that you can't simply say that they're experiencing, that the disciples are experiencing.
Except for the people who have lost a loved one. They're not sick. They're completely normal, as you said earlier.
Experiencing something like this, and walk away as if you've provided a reasonable and cogent answer, because that's simply not the case. Obviously there's no treatment in the first century for anything like any of these conditions. Yet the disciples organized the rapid expansion of Christianity.
The disciples did that? Or was it the second generation? When did Christianity really take off? Someone in the live stream chat. What year did it really, meet that parabolic coronavirus type inflection point where they just started really growing? Was it from the disciples?
In the first century, to the point that by AD 60, Nero is launching a mass persecution campaign against Christianity, so that these...
Yeah, I think it's closer to 70, right? And how many disciples would be alive at that point? I just watched N.T. Wright yesterday, a video. He was talking about the coronavirus, and he basically was saying, he was affirming the idea that back in Jesus' day, people didn't live to 70, 80 years old. And if they were about Jesus' age, that's basically, they would have been 70, 80 years old, maybe 60. The probability is anyone who walked and talked with Jesus, they were dying off or dead by the time the Gospels were written.
People were intentional, capable.
Yeah, Camille, he said something that was a red flag to me. You can type it in the live. I'm curious to see if you're going to type in the live stream chat what I caught.
Well planned, and did something that affected, the major power of the world at that time. They weren't sick. They weren't mentally ill. That's difficult.
Okay, so I'm going to steel man him here because Christians need to feel loved. What this man is saying is that people who hallucinate, that there's a cause, and that cause, one of the causes is sickness, mental illness. And usually people who are sick and mentally ill, they can't organize and construct a movement to cause such a growth of Christianity that we see in the first century. Before 60 AD, I think he's saying. And so therefore, for anyone to say that the disciples hallucinated, this is rubbish. Because how could they be sick, mentally ill, troubled, and still coordinate this massive movement, building churches and so forth, that we see prior to 60 AD that led to the destruction of the temple and so forth? Am I steel manning him correctly? Am I hearing him right?
Difficult to support as being logical.
Yeah, I've actually got a quote from the paper. It says, quote, person suffering from psychosis.
Camille, my resident historian guy says, and DB Cisco says, Nero was launching a Christian persecution campaign? That's news to me.
Jesus' time, not having benefited from modern medical treatment, might well be considered lunatics or demon-possessed. For example, Matthew 4:24. They would be unlikely candidates to organize as a group and implement the rapid and historic widespread expansion.
Yeah, lunatics or demon-possessed, if you have these types of hallucinations. Dr. Bergeron, was your grandmother a lunatic? Was she demon-possessed when she heard your grandfather talk to her, which you just talked about? Remember, I played that first. If you came late, rewind and watch that. A very reasonable, naturalistic explanation Dr. Bergeron has already presented. That maybe there's this charismatic person that everybody loved, or a lot of people loved. He died, tragic death. They were just totally taken aback, and they started experiencing one by one this Jesus. Maybe just a handful of them, but that handful started the movement
of the Christian religion during the first century.
Yes, absolutely. Well written.
Was that you that wrote that, or was that Gary?
It was me.
Oh, nice. All right. Well, let's. So
Gary may disagree.
So one of the things that I hear so often from Michael Licona and even Gary Habermas is that when people propose the hallucination hypothesis, one of the most difficult things that it has, one of the biggest problems that it has, is accounting for the group hallucinations that are cited in the biblical accounts.
Yes, the group hallucination. First of all, I'm not convinced that a group hallucination cannot occur, especially if there's in a setting where there's triggers to lead people to hallucinate certain things. But even assuming that you can never, ever have a group hallucination of, let's say, more than 2 people, you're still assuming that the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is true. And a creed is a set of beliefs. I think he goes on to talk about 1 Corinthians 15 here. This gets back to the fundamental core difference between the Christian and the non-Christian who's investigated this stuff. They just don't believe it's true. What is more likely? And you can even assume the worst nefarious motives. And I think you would still be more reasonable to say, it's more reasonable to say that people lie than that a man comes back from the dead. That's extremely reasonable because we have so many cases of people lying for a cause versus people rising from the dead, right? That's reasonable. But Doug, this is in the Bible. This is God's word. Okay, I gotcha.
And I've even got another quote. You say, quote, collective hallucination as an explanation for the disciples' post-crucifixion group experiences of Jesus is indefensible. That's a pretty strong claim.
Yeah, it's true, though. it's
tell me why. Tell me why.
Well, because, first off, I should say that what used to be called mass hysteria is...
Wasn't there a group hallucination with Joseph Smith and his friends when they saw Jesus? Or does it say that just Joseph Smith saw Jesus when he appeared to him? What's more likely, that Joseph Smith and his friends lied? Or Jesus actually appeared to them? Someone, if there's an ex-Mormon here, you can fact check me on that. But I think Joseph Smith said that he was with, at least in one instance, with some of his friends when either an angel or Jesus appeared to them, plural.
In more modern times called mass or group sociogenic illness. And so we should acknowledge that groups of people can experience things, even visual or auditory experiences that are psychologically driven. So that does occur. They're not common, but they do occur. Let me turn my phone off.
Yeah, he talked about that.
Yeah, no worries.
So he talked. By the way, the timestamp on the original video is 30 minutes 16 seconds, where he talks about that it's not common, but it occurs. The psychological cause of these hallucinations.
So they do occur, but the group dynamic is very different than the disciples. People that experience those things, the group sociogenic illness people, they have a sense of community. They have a sense of excitement. They have a sense of expectation.
He's describing a Pentecostal church that you'll even find today. Imagine the wildest Pentecostal church in a remote part of Africa, which I think do exist. I think the Pentecostals have penetrated Africa. I think that's a good example of what maybe the first century Christians were like. It's like very superstitious, believing in demons and ghosts and angels and spirits of all sorts, and very charismatic, believing in healings, and I think they would say Jesus appeared to them every Sunday morning and Wednesday in the evening service.
That's in contradistinction to the disciples who were not like that. All of them saw Jesus die. Luke chapter 23, John and Mary are close by, but everybody else was afar off. They were watching. They saw everything.
They saw everything. They were far off and saw everything. And does it say, someone can fact check me on this too, but does it say in Luke, did he say Luke 23 that the disciples were there and saw it?
They were in hiding. They were forlorn. Nobody went to the tomb on the third day except the ladies who were going to complete the embalming process.
So they were in hiding, but they weren't hiding when they watched the crucifixion.
Nobody went there to have a church service and welcome Jesus back. Nobody expected that. They were in hiding. So the group dynamic wasn't there. The Jews, Pharisees, not everybody, the Sadducees didn't, but most Jews had an expectation of the resurrection at the end of time, but not 3 days from now. So it just wasn't in their consciousness.
It wasn't in their consciousness unless this charismatic figure told them that he would rise from the dead, right? Then it would be in their consciousness. If let's say this charismatic figure named Jesus actually did say, oh, by the way, just like the temple will be destroyed and raised, I will be destroyed and raised. And maybe some of them were, in retrospect, after Jesus died and they had these bereavement type hallucinations, that they've put the puzzle pieces together and said, oh, yeah, that's what he meant.
It was not in their expectation. So it's very different from a group dynamic where someone may potentially have a collective visual experience of some sort. But beyond that, the most important point is that any hallucinatory symptom occurs exclusively in the milieu of the person's brain. If you and I were hallucinating, it wouldn't be the same thing. It couldn't possibly be the same thing. It's an individual experience.
Yeah, so going back to your grandmother, Dr. Bergeron, Your grandpa died. Your grandmother had a vision of him. I think you said vision, but maybe you just said auditory. And let's say you have an aunt, your grandfather, or great aunt, your grandfather's sister, also had a vision or some type of experience of your grandfather after he died. That's two people now. Now, that's not a group hallucination, but they both have experienced your grandfather, right?
And that is the case with the group sociogenic illness phenomena. When it's studied, the people in that group, even if they have similar experiences that are psychologically mediated, they're not precisely the same.
Right, they're not precise. I would agree with that. That sounds very reasonable. But now we're getting back to the reliability of the Gospels, right? Now you're stuck with just believing what the text says, that Jesus appeared to 500 at one time, or the disciples. You're basically assuming that what the text says is true. And if you're going to assume that, then there's no need to even go into any other evidence. Just read it and you're done.
And so that just doesn't equate to the disciples' experience. And there are numerous reports in the Gospels of group encounters with the resurrected Jesus.
Right, yeah. It says in the Gospels that Jesus appeared to the women and the men and in Galilee and on the road and in the tomb and so many different places. It's obvious that, well, it says it, so that must have happened.
I think, to me, what I think is the most important of those descriptions is the first creed of the Christian Church in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that predates Paul, but Paul wrote it down for us, so we have it. And it's, a creed is an authoritative statement of faith and belief.
That's what a creed is, an authoritative statement of faith and belief. But not all beliefs are historically true, right?
Was circulating among believers at that time. It would have been something they recited during their group meetings, more likely than not. But Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised from the dead on the third day. Then he appeared to Peter. Then he appeared to all the disciples.
It's over at this point. It clearly says this in 1 Corinthians 15, so we're done. All you have to do is read it, and it says that, and this is true historical record, right? What more can you say? But if you're willing to doubt that statement, that creed, that belief is maybe not historically accurate or true, then it puts a lot of these other hypotheses into play. Camille Greger says, in 1968 to 1971, in Zaytoun, Egypt, hundreds of thousands of people reported seeing apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Many photographed it. It's just blobs of light. Yeah, what if a group of people in a very charismatic state and very emotional state, let's say there was close to 500 of them, saw something, a cloud, a Jesus-shaped cloud, or Jesus-shaped lights, and thought it was Jesus appearing to them. This is Camille talking, not me. Would you believe it, Christians? Do you believe the 1968 to 1971 in Zaytoun, Egypt, that the Virgin Mary actually appeared to hundreds of thousands of people? Do you believe it? Actually, I think a lot of Christians would say, yeah, we do believe it, but it was Satan. It was his demons causing people to be deceived. Well, maybe it was Satan and demons that were causing the appearance of Jesus. Or maybe Jesus didn't appear to them at all, but Jesus implanted. Now, you believe in miracles, Christians, right? Like, don't be against miracles. What if, since Satan's powerful, he can do miracles, what if Satan actually implanted a group hallucination in all those people, those 500 people and the disciples? Some master plan to deviate people from the truth of Judaism. What if Satan did that? What if Satan was the psychological cause for the group hallucination? Remember, if you're a person who believes in God and believes that miracles are possible and that there's a spiritual warfare out there, then isn't that hypothesis on the table now? That the cause of a group hallucination is Satan himself? Come on, you got to be open to that possibility if you value truth.
Then he appeared to 500 people at the same time, most of whom are still living.
Most of whom are still living. How many people lived past age 55, 60 back then? Most? I think not.
Now, we can't say that, Creed, because all those people are long
I think the text is some, not most.
ago passed away. But in those days, in the early church, which even Bart Ehrman dates that to 1 or 2 years after the crucifixion, I think Gary Habermas says it's at least by the third year that was in practice among the churches. So, it's almost like a challenge. These people are still alive. You can go find them. You can go talk to them.
Yeah, these people are still alive. You can go find them, go talk to them. Not if they're dead, right? You can't talk to them. And maybe, what if these texts were written at a place 1,000 miles away from the purported event, that the people who actually could have seen these things are like 1,000 miles away?
So it sounds like the main issue that you're pointing out here with the group hallucination hypothesis is that hallucinations are something that happen in someone's brain. It's like a dream. It's like you can't have a dream and then invite someone to like come experience the dream with you.
Yeah, sort of like the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit's inside you.
Is that the main thing that you're pointing out with this one?
But yet, it seems like in a group setting, a bunch of believers can share into the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit. Like where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there's a unity of fellow believers in that sense, right?
Yeah,
do we have any reports of group hallucinations like this in the literature?
Yes.
Camille, I think he's talking about Paul's letters, not the Gospels, at 55 AD.
Group sociogenic illness is something that's recognized. And to have visual experiences, it is known and it has been observed. They're not common, but they do occur. And I reference those in the article. But study of those individuals, they don't have the same experience. It's separate. And
we don't know, even if it's true that 500 saw Jesus, that Jesus appeared to them. We can't interview those 500 people and say, what exactly did you see, hear, feel, touch? Write it down for us, please. And by the way, put your name on it so your reputation's at stake. Okay, that was your experience. Number 2, what did you experience? Number 3, what did you experience? This man, Dr. Bergeron, is assuming that even if it's true that 500 experience or Jesus appeared to 500, that these are all the same experience, right? Isn't that a reasonable assumption that I'm making about what he's saying?
How could it be the same? It just can't possibly be the same. It's a psychologically mediated experience, even though it's perceived as real to you, or me, or whoever's experiencing that. It's only occurring exclusively in the brain of the individual that's experiencing it. So how can 500 people have the same experience?
You're assuming that 500 people had the same experience. The text actually doesn't say that the 500 had the same experience, does it? Remember, the experience is inside the individual. What if we were to interview the 500 and get conflicting stories of what appeared to them? I don't think, if you're someone who values truth, Dr. Joseph Bergeron, I think you would have to concede that point, right? Now, we don't exactly know what these 500 people, if there even was 500 people to begin with, assuming that's true, we don't know exactly what they experienced and if it was the same.
At the same time, they can't. If it's hallucinatory, that's not possible.
So one way out of this is to say, well, look, we can just deny the reliability of...
Yes, there you go, Cameron.
...the reports of group hallucinations in the biblical accounts. Do you think that's like a feasible way out of this in your mind?
No, I mean...
No, of course it is If you don't believe the text, then it becomes easy. Of course, that's a feasible way out. Now, you can disagree that the Bibles are reliable, and they give this is a ancient Greco-Roman biography that is capturing history, and is primarily concerned with history, and therefore, when we read it through all the attestations, and you combine that with the martyrdom, we have a very good reason. The transcripts, the manuscripts, thousands upon thousands. We have a very good case, a cumulative case, to think that the Gospels and Paul's works are reliable. But if they're not reliable, then boom, we're done. We could just say, well, no, we have good reason to think that Jesus never appeared to 500. In fact, you can take the very basic part of the historical method of having 2 or more sources for a specific claim. Where, oh, where do we have 2 or more sources that Jesus appeared to 500 people? Some people will realize this problem exists, and they'll talk about Acts, the day of Pentecost. That's what the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is referring to. But no, you can't assume that. So we only have one source, Paul, saying that 500 people, making a claim of 500 people, saw Jesus, or Jesus appeared to them. And it's not even clear. And if you came late, I played that the word appeared could mean just, it's like an aha moment. They got it. It's not necessarily a bodily, visual appearance. In chapter 2 of the book, I go into a lengthy discussion about why we know that the Gospels are reliable eyewitness accounts. And there's, extensive history that shows that the Gospels were written by who they say we know that they were written by, and it can be traced back. Yeah, we know who wrote the Gospels. You're becoming, I think you're a Protestant, Dr. Bergeron, but now you're really sounding like a Roman Catholic to me, relying on the traditions of the Holy Fathers, the early church.
And the accuracy has been preserved through time. So we know that those things, you can say they weren't true, or you could say whatever you want to say, but to say that they have been corrupted doesn't follow.
To say they haven't been corrupted doesn't follow. Yeah, I guess for a Christian, you just can't admit that they've been corrupted. Well, even the word corrupt has this connotation, but I think you can say they've been changed, can you not? Do I have to bring up quotes from famous historians in the Oxford Annotated Bible again? No, please don't make me do that. For non-evangelical historians, this is, I think, a fairly held view that the Gospels, the New Testament, was changed in parts, for better or for worse. And Mark is a good example.
To say that they are something different than what the writer intended, that doesn't follow either. So those things, the Gospels can reasonably and reliably be taken as eyewitness accounts.
Oh, if what you're saying is true, that the Gospels can be taken as reliable eyewitness accounts, well, then we're done. We just read it and we're done. Okay, so what's an eyewitness account? It's someone saying, I saw this. And Paul said that, so we're done. Oh, who else said that? That they saw the body. Who else had an eyewitness account in the Gospels or in the New Testament? I can't think of anybody besides Paul. We have an anonymous author saying that people saw Jesus, but we don't have an eyewitness account other than Paul, do we? Oh, yeah, Revelation 1. And maybe 1st and 2nd Peter, but it was an eyewitness to his majesty and glory, not necessarily the bodily resurrection. I think Christians need to help me on the eyewitness accounts that we have in the New Testament.
By the people that knew Jesus best, and that they record what they saw and what they heard.
If you want a deeper defense of that, I would just say, check out the book, right? And it's actually a good time. Chapter 2 of the book, and this is a good time to mention that we are going to do a giveaway at the end of this stream.
A giveaway, yes. Yeah, I think I'll end it here. The bottom line is this type of live stream, this type of video that Cameron Bertuzzi did on Capturing Christianity, is its purpose is to build the confidence of people who already believe this stuff. For someone who is critically minded, yes, I said that. So for someone who's reasonable and critically minded, they're not going to accept at face value the Bible, what it says. I think very reasonable people will say some things are historically accurate and probably some things aren't. And just like Dr. Bergeron threw Gerd Ludemann's book on the ground and talked to it when Gerd Ludemann suggested the hallucination hypothesis, and he said that anybody who's medically minded would never have said that. Well, someone who's medically minded wouldn't jump to the conclusion that we have a reliable account saying that a man who's dead came back from the dead and walked around. Someone who's medically minded wouldn't jump to that conclusion. They wouldn't. That wouldn't be the, oh yeah, this is reasonable. No, a reasonable person, I think, would say, I need a ton of evidence to overcome this. And for non-Christians, that ton of evidence is not there. The evidence is not sufficient. And some would even say there is no evidence. This is what separates a Christian from non-Christian. And I want Christians to know, I get you, I understand you, I know what you believe and why you believe it. Especially if you give me more details of what type of Christian you are. I'm a little shaky on the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, but Protestants I know pretty well. And all the versions, most of the versions of Protestants. I understand you. I understand why you believe this stuff. And when I played the Q&A, if you came late, about a great question from a lawyer from New York asking, what's the opposing view to what you're saying right now? And he's like, Dr. Bergeron was like tongue-tied, and Cameron had to come bail him out. The fact that you can't quickly say, well, he kind of said it right here. But if you can't quickly say, well, oh yeah, the way out of this is to say that when it says Jesus appeared to 500, that's just not true. It didn't happen. It was made up. It was propaganda to build the confidence in the movement. Boom, we're done, right? You don't even have to talk about group hallucinations at that point. And if you came late, this is the biggest part I thought was valuable in this live stream, was Dr. Bergeron gave a naturalistic explanation, other than the resurrection, for how we could have the evidence that we have and Jesus not rising from the dead. And that is the bereavement hypothesis. There was a small group of people who loved this charismatic figure named Jesus. He died. They were devastated. And Jesus appeared to them in hallucinations, just like his grandfather, Bergeron's grandfather, appeared to his grandmother, which he talked about, which is completely normal, happens in 5 to 15% of the general population, and it happens when someone deeply loves another person who's died. Perfect, naturalistic, reasonable explanation, hypothesis, for the data that we see. Am I out to lunch? Is that isn't that extremely reasonable? That's assuming again that half of what the New Testament says has actually happened in the past. See, I told you guys when I first started this live stream that it won't get above 90 people in this live stream chat, this live stream. And sure enough. So the notifications are not going out. Unless maybe I suck. And my channel's going down. But I used to get within half an hour, 150, 160, and oftentimes over 200 people here. See ya, DB. I guarantee Jesus did not ascend into heaven because, like most stuff in the Bible, it isn't well defined. Like, what would it even mean for a God to die? And no, WTF is a kind. The ascension's an amazing part because if Jesus did rise from the dead and didn't ascend, he would have been around for years, right? The ascension is important to the resurrection. Sometimes I don't get a notification that says, go New York, go New York, go. Or goni go, goni goni go. I like that better. Give Doug a lollipop, see if he licks or sucks. No, it's weird because I did a live stream a couple days ago, and I think the max people showed up was 69 or something. And usually it tails off after that in the stats the days after. But then the day after, it ramped right up to like 200 views or something. So there's definitely something screwy going on. Poof. My apologies to Dr. Bergeron. He was scheduled to come on, but we ran out of time. Have a good day, guys. Take care.